Hello, this is Let's Talk About Myths, baby, and I am your host, Liv, here with, as promised, as much hyped, the very special conversation episode with author Jennifer Saint, all about her new and very much anticipated novel, Ariadne. So obviously, it's about Ariadne, but it is a retelling of the story of Ariadne and Phaedra and the Minotaur and all of that incredibleness from the perspective of women. What a concept. Something we so rarely get in anything ancient and so sorely due to us. I highly recommend you read this book, buy it, read it, love it. Let's support women writing any and everything in classics. It just keeps getting better and better. And of course, you will remember Jennifer because she came on the show to talk about Phaedra more recently. She's also a listener of the podcast, and so it's extra exciting for me to get to talk to her about this new book that she's written. So absolutely cool. I hope you all enjoy it. I hope you all pre-order her book. It's coming out next week in the UK, and I think in early May in North America. So we all have options. Definitely pick up a copy. And with that out of the way, here is the wonderful conversation we had about Ariadne and Phaedra and writing mythological women in novels. It was so fun. Conversations, more than the Labyrinth, more than Theseus, Ariadne with Jennifer Saint. Wonderful. So thank you so much, Jennifer Saint. You are back with me on the show. Now, one of the few people I've talked to more than once on the podcast, but today here to talk about your new and exciting book that's coming out just in probably like a week or two from when I release this episode, Ariadne. Thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, thank you. I'm so honored to be a repeat guest. Thank you so much.
I mean, you have such perfect timing where we were able to talk about these two major characters from your book since, last time you were on the show to talk Phaedra and now we're talking Ariadne. But of course, Phaedra plays a big part in your book. Yeah, so before we dive into that, because she's one of my questions, but do you want to maybe we'll start by, do you have like an elevator pitch about what exactly your book is about?
Yeah, sure. So Ariadne is the young princess of Crete, and she has grown up in the palace of Knossos with the Minotaur bellowing in the labyrinth underneath the palace floor until the day that Theseus arrives, the prince of Athens who has come as a tribute to the monster, but convinces Ariadne to betray her father and her kingdom to help him to destroy the monster.
And I mean, what a fun story. I obviously love Ariadne and I hate Theseus. So I was thrilled for the chance to read your book. Now we'll kind of watch. We don't want to give away too many spoilers, but as you and I were saying kind of off of the mic beforehand, it is hard to spoil too much of the story because it is a myth that I personally have told on the podcast many times. So that's a little bit of a perk. We can talk about it a little bit more.
Yeah, I think the story is like 2,000 years old. You've gone past the spoiler alert a little bit.
Exactly. Yeah. Like obviously you've made some choices and so we won't dive into, too much of what would count as a spoiler in terms of your own editorial choices in writing the book.
Yeah.
But obviously we can say, it starts with Ariadne on Crete. Theseus comes in. We think he's a good guy. I loved the beginning of Theseus because you can see why she thinks he's a good guy, But as, you know, me personally reading it, I can read in the way you write Theseus that he is very good at convincing people he's the good guy, but really he's Theseus.
I'm so glad that that came across. I so enjoyed writing Theseus and trying to think about, well, how would he have wanted to present himself? How would he have convinced Ariadne? But also, how can I drop some hints for my reader that this is not necessarily the person that he truly is?
Oh yeah, and no, I think you did it perfectly. I mean, before I started reading it, I was a little weary because you never know. I mean, it
No.
wouldn't have been out of the realm for you to choose to present him as not a shitty guy, and that's, you know, that's a fine choice. People are allowed to make it, but I would personally have trouble, you know, reading that version because of, I mean, I think Theseus is just so objectively bad that I find it to be a stretch if someone were to try to convince me that he was a good guy. But no, it was sort of like as soon as he showed up, you could tell he believes he's this hero, and he is, you know, he can convince Ariadne that he's so perfect and impressive because she's also at this point, you know, she's only lived on Knossos her whole life, and so this hero coming in from another land and talking about all of these incredible tales of wonder, you're gonna just kind of fall under their spell. It would be really hard not to. So I think he definitely conveys that point. Like, how did you kind of get into the mind of Theseus when you were writing that?
Well, there was a lot more Theseus in my early drafts, so we did cut him down quite a lot because obviously it's not his story, and that had to be at the forefront of my mind. That this is the whole point of writing it, was to give Ariadne her voice so Ariadne could tell the story, and to kind of flip it. So rather than her being a footnote in his legend, he's more the kind of addendum to her story. But to do that, I did write a lot more Theseus in there. I had him recount his whole journey from Trozen, and I really enjoyed writing it. It was the right choice to take it out, but it was just really good to immerse myself into that like traditional heroic narrative, as to help me to bounce off it and to do the counter narrative and to do something different from it. I kind of felt like I needed to write that first, kind of write the sort of the straight, this is how Theseus sees himself version, so that then I could move away from it.
That makes sense. And I mean, he did, you know, think so very highly of himself, and certainly so did so many in ancient Greece and in Athens specifically. He was the hero of Athens. You know, I don't think you would hear an ancient Athenian talking about him the way I do, or even
No.
close. But I think with him it's so interesting because he really, like, I also, you know, in thinking about him as a real person, would have sort of gone a similar way to you, where it's just like this man believes he's as good as he thinks,
Yeah.
you know, but ultimately everything he does is objectively bad, but he can't see that. He's just like, I'm hell-bent on being like the hero.
Yeah, I think he really believes his own hype. He's really seduced by his own legend. And I just thought so driven by his own glory and wanting to be famous as that legendary hero.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And obviously we don't want to spend too much time talking about Theseus, but I have now made it an accidental goal of like every conversation I have with anyone to make sure that we get in at least a few jabs at Theseus.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, this story is about Ariadne, and you know, her life in general. I find that interesting. So it's a lot of her from start to finish, beyond just kind of wanting to give her a voice, which I think is really important, especially in a character like Ariadne, who really is kind of a footnote in a few different stories.
Mm.
How did you approach sort of telling her story start to finish?
I mean, the first thing was that I really wanted to read her story because I think I might have said to you last time, my children are really interested in Greek mythology, so I was telling them the stories at the same time as reading all these like brilliant Greek mythology retellings that are coming out, that have been out, and so I looked for Ariadne's story and I couldn't find it anywhere, which is why I decided to write it. And she came really fully formed when I started writing her voice. She just seemed to come really naturally. So it's kind of difficult to think like how did I do it start to finish? Really, she was there. She just seemed to be kind of waiting and to be written.
Yeah. Well, that's just lovely. I mean, that's certainly an answer in itself, right? It's just sort of she was asking for that. And I think she as a character really is kind of that way. Like there seems to be so much you can get out of her that isn't like that is and isn't told in the myths, because when you're talking about Ariadne in the mythology, you're either talking about Ariadne in relation to the Minotaur, in relation to Theseus, in relation to Dionysus, but there is so much of her when you kind of look at her as a whole that is sort of waiting to be told. So I think, yeah, I mean, it's sort of perfect.
Yeah, and I thought, I mean, one of the things I was really interested in, it was the idea that she had some kind of affection for the Minotaur as well, and
Mm-hmm.
that was probably a starting point to think, why would she feel that towards him? What does that tell you about her? That she's compassionate, that she's kind, that she's loving, that she sees the best in people, and that seemed to be a recurring theme with her. She sees the best in the Minotaur at the start. She sees the best in Theseus. And then she sees the best in Dionysus as well.
Yeah, that's very true. And I love that idea that as monstrous as the Minotaur was, he wasn't necessarily hated by everyone, because I think you have this familial relation, even if it is bizarre and quite troubling. But
Mm.
she was his half sister, so I think it's nice to have some kind of appreciation and love for that part, even if it was kind of hard to love him as well.
Yeah, especially as he grew and became more of his monstrous
Hmm.
nature. But I thought as well, it just wasn't the Minotaur's fault what happened to him. So
Hmm.
I thought she would feel that pity for him as well.
And for Pasiphae too, because it
Mm.
wasn't her fault either, and it's a lot of. I like how Minos is the pretty clear villain, even from the first pages of the book, or certainly at the beginning, but and I think that's so true, because I mean, he did start it all with his war and his horrible actions with Scylla, something that I've told on the podcast and that you kind of open with.
Yeah,
And to have, all the people from Athens, the youths from Athens, sacrifice to the Minotaur, and Minos just kind of having no pity for anyone, no sympathy for anyone. So did you kind of start out thinking Minos was going to be so bad, or how did that kind of come about?
yeah, I did. And I came across the story with Scylla just on the first day that I started researching, and it wasn't a story that I'd seen before. And that
Mm-hmm.
seemed to chime so perfectly with the idea that I had of what this character was going to be. The fact that he just seemed so incredibly calculating about everything that he did. And then the demanding of the hostages from Athens is just so cruel, so cold, and so completely unnecessary. But he was famously a judge of souls in the underworld. That's what he
Mm-hmm.
became after he died. So I was really interested in how somebody famed for being righteous, which is obviously how the novel starts, was also committing these like completely heinous actions. And he just struck me as really a really sociopathic kind of character.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've sort of found more and more of my kind of distaste for him as I went as well. Like, I covered the story of Pasiphae and the Minotaur really early on, and then much more recently, even I think just last year, sort of I also kind of came across the story of Minos and Scylla, and this is another Scylla, not the monstrous Scylla. There are a number of Scyllas in Greek
Yeah,
mythology, which I love, but this is the story where he was basically like laying siege to, I forget where she lived, but essentially, I mean, the long story short of it is that he drowned her on the prow of his ship.
yeah.
So yeah, so I mean, just that, and then the fact that his actions with the bull of Poseidon are what kind of broke Pasiphae and then caused the Minotaur, and it's really, yeah, like he's the cause of all of it, really.
But gets held up as some kind of moral arbiter, which just
Yeah.
seemed to lay bare the entire misogynistic system.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's an interesting one too, because I wonder, and this is now just me like questioning all my little Greek mythological things that come up for me all the time, but I know the stories, like I'm almost curious the regional aspects of the stories, because that always makes such a huge impact.
Mm.
Like, was he originally a judge when you're telling the story from the point of view of Crete? And I think a lot of the bad of Minos is coming from the story told from the point of view of the Athenians.
Yeah.
And that doesn't make it, that it doesn't mean that he was like inherently better over on Crete, but they would have seen him differently because
Mm.
he was their mythological king. I mean, they were called the Minoans, named for him. So much in the way that Athens didn't think Theseus was a piece of human garbage, the Cretans wouldn't have thought Minos was. And so it's always really interesting to me to think about that regionally too. Obviously, in a novel, you can't get hung up on that because, I mean, even in mythology, I try not to get hung up on that because there's only so much we can do with the sources we have. But
Yeah.
it's an interesting thing to think about too, like kind of how they might have spun him to be not quite so malicious and awful.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, one thing obviously with this family, you focus a lot on Phaedra, like more than I was expecting, given it's called Ariadne. Did you always intend to do that? Kind of how did Phaedra come about for you? I feel like you might have mentioned it a little bit when we talked last time, but definitely like tell us more now.
So she now narrates some of the chapters, so she gets to tell
Mm.
her story, but that wasn't originally part of the novel at all. So I wanted to have her story in there, but bringing her in as a narrator was something that I did after I'd already written the first draft, and it was really because there's so much of her story that is so interesting that can't be told if she's not the person telling it, because so much of it is internal. The way that she struggles with her feelings for Hippolytus, for example.
Mm-hmm.
If I didn't have her telling her story, then it was really hard to convey what that story really was, because she's so alone, she's so isolated for a lot of the time. So she just seemed to really need that space in the book, and it just kept on growing as I went through and rewrote and edited. There just seemed to be so much more to say about her. And the fact that she has her own relationship with Theseus after Ariadne is gone just merited so much exploration, because it's and I think I talked about this a little bit last time. It's just this idea that she saw what her sister wanted, the life that Ariadne wanted for herself, and then Phaedra ends up living it, and it is nothing that she could have expected it to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's also kind of unexpected. Like you're reading all these chapters from Ariadne and then like suddenly there's a switch and you get Phaedra. And I really
Yeah.
enjoyed that because I agree. I think it's really important to have her voice. And so to have that little like burst of Phaedra throughout, I that really made me, I mean, feel for her, but also just I think it really made the book much more well-rounded, and like you really kind of got everything in there, because I think it's fascinating, the idea of what you said, her getting the life that Ariadne wanted, but also the details of it, like her life in Athens, kind of how she copes, what it's like being Theseus's wife. I enjoy that, he's off a lot doing his heroic, quote unquote, heroic things and all of that, and kind of how she exists both when he's there and when he's gone. And yeah, I really enjoyed the Phaedra sections for sure.
Well, I liked playing with the idea that obviously he's credited with being the founder of Athens and having done so many important things. And I thought, well, he was off doing all his terrible things so much. He had to go and abduct people and all the rest of it. So he was really doing the work. And I just thought it would be interesting to imagine that maybe it was Phaedra who was responsible for all of the good that he achieved, or was supposed to have achieved. And I just really enjoy multiple narratives in a book. It's something as a reader that I always look for. I always really like. I mean, my favourite book in the world is The Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Kingsolver, and that is 4 sisters and their mother, alternate perspectives, and I love that, especially when it's 2 sisters like Ariadne and Phaedra, to see the way that they see the same events differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it definitely adds so much, especially when you're dealing with first person narratives, because like obviously you're really limited in those. Like I think they're important because I really enjoy first person just because you get a real sense into the psyche of the
Yeah.
character, but then at the same time you are kind of locked in. So adding that extra character equally in first person sort of you get those different kind of aspects of it. So how did you approach deciding what to keep like sort of explicit to the mythology and what to fictionalize? Did you have any like really strong thoughts about what you wanted to change and what you wanted to keep, without giving away too much in the way of spoilers?
Yeah, I mean, one thing was that I needed to keep the action going throughout the whole novel. And so I did have to give Ariadne kind of more things to do than necessarily is in existing mythology. And obviously things that I think she would have done, that, stories about her that just aren't told. So her whole life really on Naxos was something that I really had to fictionalize. I had to imagine the Maenads coming and following Dionysus, thinking, well, what kind of a relationship might Dionysus's wife have had with his female followers? What sort of dynamic would that create? How would they all coexist together? So all of that, I imagined how the Ariadne that I'd created as my character would have wanted to make her life like on Naxos. So all of that obviously was completely fictionalized.
Mm-hmm.
But the key things from the mythology that I really wanted to make sure I kept, obviously, the main events of the story, I wanted to keep them and weave a story around them. So kind of filling in the blanks, making the motivations make sense, covering the time periods of their lives that perhaps I couldn't find anywhere, and thinking, well, what would have fitted? What would they have done?
Mm-hmm. Obviously, when you're covering women characters, that's so common, where there's just these like huge gaps where no one cared what was going on, especially with someone like Ariadne, where she is so tied to two different major male characters. Or,
Yeah.
I don't even want to necessarily say Dionysus is male because he's Dionysus
Yeah.
of all the gods, but to like sort of more obviously, like, I mean, they were men in the way that they were covered, as much as
Yeah.
Dionysus is sort of fluid in a lot of ways. He's referred to as a he for the most part, and also he is covered as if he's a he, in that he actually has stories about him that don't revolve around men.
Yeah.
Ariadne is such a fascinating character, but she is one that's sort of lost in that. So I think she's such a perfect character to cover from
Yeah.
a woman's perspective.
And just what we talked about with Phaedra last time as well, that I wanted to keep a lot of her story, but I did not want to perpetuate the false rape accusation. So that was something where I made I knew from the start that I was going to tell her story differently.
Mm-hmm. I think it's well done without giving anything away. I think the way you kept to the myth, but also made sure that wasn't part of it.
Oh, thank you.
Because I mean, I obviously would feel exactly the same way of like the level of not going to there. But then also as somebody who's like very, we talked about this last time, that when I'm working on trying to write fiction, but I am so obsessed with accuracy in my podcast when it comes to the myths that I have trouble with fiction because I have trouble letting go. Yeah. So I kind of really connected to that part where it's like it really is pretty, you're really sticking close to accuracy without quite going into that realm of the darkness that is the story of Phaedra.
Yeah.
We just talked off mic a little bit about some spoilers that I just had to know about because that's what I do. I've done it with like every time I interview anyone about a book. I'm like, hey, but I want to know this just for me, even though we won't put it in because it's a spoiler. But it did lead me to an interesting question. We were just talking about chronology in Greek mythology. And so this is something that comes up for me a lot, comes up for my listeners a lot. If you're not too deep into classics in Greek mythology, I think you have this idea based on storytelling in our time and in certainly recent even centuries, that chronology and timelines are important and something people think about. But because of Greek mythology being told orally over thousands of years and regionally, where these regions cared about their myths, they didn't care about other regions' myths, they were not at all a united culture, you get a lot of stories that don't at all match up in terms of timelines. Is that something that you encountered and kind of had to work around, or did you just sort of say no, like I'm not going to deal with trying to figure that out at all?
Yeah, I encountered it. I think when I started writing, I tried to write a timeline that made sense. And then I abandoned that. And I was just like, okay, well, this is the novel. This is Ariadne's lifespan. This is where I'm going to put events so that they make sense in a novel. And I am not even going to attempt to grapple with the various completely conflicting timelines that you find in mythology. And the same goes for family trees as well, which are often kind of circular or at least very tangled. So there are some sort of family connections in there that some people are going to spot and think, hang on, aren't those two actually brothers? And originally in the book they were, and it required so much explanation. And I really wanted to weave in a lot of other myths and a lot of other stories. And I did it as much as I could. But there did come a point where I had to think, this is now just for like complete classics nerds, and it's not going to be interesting to other people. So there are some sort of family connections which I didn't explore.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard because, and it's all tied to those regional things, because each region wanted their person to be associated with all these famous events. And so a lot of the things that we have don't make any sense purely because it's just like the certain aspects that have and have not survived in terms of things that were actually written down, relations that don't make any sense or anything. But I do think, fortunately, when it comes to Ariadne, you had a pretty clear basic timeline to work with, which was probably really helpful. You know, you have the family line on Crete, and and then the inclusion of Theseus and Dionysus is like, that's pretty straightforward, fortunately. Yeah. When you're diving into more peripheral characters and, you know, other people in there, you get into some trickier bits. But
yeah. And I think the age gap between Ariadne and Phaedra is quite unclear. So I had to decide what that age gap was going to be. I think some of the stories perhaps suggest that there's a lot more time between them, because their stories don't really intersect anywhere. And I wanted them to intersect. I wanted them to have a relationship.
I think that's really important. I think having that sisterly bond really adds a lot to the story, but it also adds a lot to women's stories, you know, like there's a strength that comes from those two being sisters and having that connection that I think is really important.
Yeah. And that really was kind of the core of the story for me.
I think that was the right call. Not that you need any kind of reassurance, but I personally appreciated it. I've kind of always imagined them as close sisters as well, without actually having any evidence of the sort. But I like the way it's handled in yours, because I think it's so interesting dealing with the fact that Ariadne was, you know, supposed to marry Theseus, abandoned by Theseus, and then Phaedra ended up marrying Theseus. And I think it's such a bizarre and tricky subject to broach, but the way it's presented in yours, I think, is well done and believable, and also has these sympathetic aspects that make you really feel for both sisters and not feel anything for Theseus, which I think is the right way to go.
Yeah, and I didn't want Ariadne to just be defined by her romantic relationships either. You know, you're telling a story from a woman's perspective. You don't want it all to be about, you know, how does she feel about Theseus? Then how does she feel about Dionysus? There's more, you know, she's a fully rounded human being.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of Dionysus, so how did you approach him? How do you feel about him as a character?
I feel with Dionysus, like he could have his own novel. He could have a dozen of his own novels, and you could cover so many aspects of his personality and his character and stories to do with him. And so that's probably where I did the most pruning, the most sort of decisions about, well, what is Dionysus going to be in this story? Because he had to be a character that can be in a novel, whereas he encompasses so many things in mythology. that you couldn't possibly include them all. So I wanted to make him somebody that I could believe in and believe that Ariadne would fall in love with, because the stories about them are romantic stories for the most part. It seems that when he came to Naxos that he was not like other gods to Ariadne. I did another interview where she said he's like hashtag not all gods, which I thought was quite appropriate.
Yeah.
He's not like Zeus, not like Poseidon. He comes to Naxos and there seems to be like a genuine relationship and genuine connection, and a consensual one between them. So I definitely wanted to preserve that aspect of Dionysus, but he's part of a story which is part of this the whole kind of narrative of this patriarchal, misogynistic society. He is still a part of that, and he is one of the Olympian gods, however much he doesn't behave like them all of the time. And there are stories about Dionysus which are so much darker as well, because I know that in so many ways he's a god who is like a friend to outcasts, and he's a rebellious god, and he walks all of these lines and crosses all of these boundaries. And there are stories about him which are so much fun, but he is a god where if you get on the wrong side of him, you will pay a serious price. And I didn't want to leave that part of his character out.
Yeah, I think that's really important and so true all around. He is, I mean, if I was to pick a god purely out of behavior, he would definitely be my favorite, in terms of the gods themselves. I have a weird thing for Ares, but not so much based on behavior. But yeah, I think, Dionysus is good in so many ways, but at the same time, he's most famous for the Bacchae, which is a very entertaining story, but it also is very dark when it comes to Dionysus's actions and how he feels when he is not being worshipped, right? Like he feels very strongly when he is not being worshipped, in certain contexts.
Very strongly.
Yeah, it's kind of, he's willing to let people get ripped apart by their own mothers, if it has to happen, it will.
That is something that it's not a one-off occurrence for him.
No. I think the Bacchae is definitely the most, famous, and it's because he was also related to these people, so it has a different level of importance. But yeah, Maenads ripping people to shreds is not exclusive to the Bacchae.
No.
So the last question I have for you, sort of an explicit question, and it's more just fun, and for me, is who was your favorite character besides Ariadne, if Ariadne would be your go-to?
It is a toss-up between Phaedra and Dionysus. I'm going to say Phaedra because she was probably the most straightforwardly enjoyable to write in the early sections of the novel. I really,
really?
I really loved who she was early on, though things didn't turn out so well for her.
I want to make clear my sarcastic really was purely because the end of Phaedra's story is unfortunately not ideal for her, but I totally get liking her at the beginning.
She was fun to write at the start, and I feel such a connection to Phaedra. I'm the younger sister in my family, and I could just really relate to how she felt.
I like that she is different from Ariadne, but also has those like sisterly similarities.
Yeah.
She's complex in that kind of way. Then beyond your book entirely, do you have a favorite person from Greek myth otherwise?
Oh, that is a really good question. That's probably something I need to have an answer for.
I get asked it all the time and I never have the same answer or a good one, so don't worry too much.
I think that my favourite character is probably Atalanta. I really love the idea of somebody being raised by bears in the forest. I love that image. And she's so sort of ferocious and independent, and I love the idea that she was the only woman on board the Argo. So yeah, I'm going to say Atalanta.
I think that's a great answer. Atalanta's wonderful, and she doesn't get enough credit.
No,
But
there's not that much about her.
no, there's definitely not. I know I plan to cover her in whatever more depth I can find. But at this point, I've only had a mini myth about her, which I think is just rude on my part. But she is a little tricky. What is the thing that you had to cut out that you most wish would have been able to stay in the book, if you can tell us?
Oh, I really wrestled with cutting out all of the Theseus part that I talked about. And I cut it down like by inches. So I was like, I'll just take a little bit out. And then I was like, no, more of it needs to go. More of it needs to go. But I mean, as appalling as it is, that is actually a really fun story to write as he just makes his way down that road, and all of those characters that he meets, you know, the weird, the bed that, you know, you have to have a bit cut off you or stretched out in order to fit in it. The man who he ends up feeding to his own monstrous turtle. I wrote all of that section. I wrote a lot of it when I was waiting for my youngest child, who was 4 at the time, to go to sleep. He's a very bad sleeper, or he was. So I used to sit outside his bedroom, and I wrote all of Theseus's narrative outside on the carpet there, and I just remember it really fondly.
That's a great answer, because I agree with you so completely. It's one of my favorite stories. Last year, in the height of the lockdown times, I was really struggling with the podcast because I was just so lacking in creativity, you know, as we all dealt with the beginning. Of course, now we've all just had to get used to it. But and so I couldn't keep going with Aeneas because he was so boring and annoying. And so I went back to Theseus, but I think it started again with what we were talking about with Scylla, because I found that story of Scylla and Minos. I think it's primarily told in Metamorphoses.
Yeah.
And I found that, and I was like, well, this is fun. And then it leads back to Crete, and then Crete leads to Theseus again. So I just ended up doing this like huge arc on that. But getting to the beginning of Theseus, I'm sure I had assumed I could do that whole section at, you know, in only a portion of an episode. Like, I originally told Theseus' story way back at the beginning of the podcast when I did a lot less research than I do now, and I did his whole story in one episode. And then when I got back to him this time, I was like, oh, this is a whole episode. This is the funniest, darkest thing in the world. Like, you didn't even get to my favorite of the bandits on the route from Trozen, which is the tree bender.
Yeah.
The guy who bends pine trees, who knows how, ties you to either end, and then just lets go. Is that in your...
Yeah.
Because I can picture it being described in a way that I found very visceral.
Yeah, I couldn't bring myself to part with all of it. And yeah, the tree bending guy had to stay in. And I think the turtle as well. I don't think I could bring myself to delete the turtle.
I mean, the turtle, it's so funny. It's so funny.
It is. It's so gruesome. And I just think sometimes it's just so fun to write something that insane.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's so dark and I love it so much. But I wonder if you had given any thought to, or if you've listened to my episode where I make this insane theory that I stand by. But I firmly believe he made all that shit up.
Yeah.
That they did it first, and he's really just a serial killer.
I mean, I can completely agree with that hypothesis. It seems totally plausible.
I mean, what is the likelihood that on one trip from one town to another, granted it's a long walk, but still, that he just happened to encounter that many of the most gruesome killers in all of Greece?
I know, and I just think, well, surely he wanted to show up in Athens with a really good story, didn't he?
Exactly.
To prove his worth. So yeah, I'm with you on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I also find Theseus really interesting because he's one of the few, if not the only, heroes who primarily killed people and not monsters.
Oh, that is interesting.
It just I think it makes his point so much more strong. You know, I mean, really, there's not a lot of heroes who killed people, but Theseus killed almost exclusively people.
I had not made that connection at all. That is completely true. And wow.
I've put a lot of thought into
Yeah, I can tell.
One thing I realize I do want to ask about, was there ever a point in the draft where Daedalus and Icarus had any more of a role, or did you, what are your thoughts on them?
Yeah, no, there was never more of them because there wasn't really the space to put more of them in.
Fair.
But I really love that story. And I had really clearly in my head, I had the image of their flight, and I knew that I definitely wanted to include that in the story. And I love how Daedalus escapes in the end, and the end that Minos comes to as well. So I put in everything to do with them that I felt was relevant to the story. I mean, the thing is, there were so many of the stories I wanted to tell. And and that's the thing about writing Greek myth, that one thing just leads to another, and you can just go on and on and on. And so I really had to think, well, I've got to be clear on which story I'm telling in this book and stick to that. But they are, I mean, Daedalus is such a great character. He could have, another book as well.
Absolutely. Well, one thing I think, and this is a good example of it, I think you did really well in putting those little kind of like Easter eggs of other myth in there, without giving anything away, but the mention, just how it is brought up, Daedalus and Icarus's escape, and the arrival of Dionysus, little bits in there, Dionysus in general.
Yeah,
I think it's really interesting that way, where you made a point to focus on Ariadne, and obviously that's important when you're telling a coherent narrative to have one thing you're focusing on. But you definitely found a way to like insert lots of other little bits of myth throughout, which I really appreciated as someone who is a nerd who's going to get every reference, except actually the one that we talked about off mic. So that's something.
No, I really liked putting in Easter eggs. That was how I thought of it as well. But that scene with Dionysus, that was one of the high points of writing. I love that story.
Me too. Absolutely. It's another one that came up as it's the story I told after Ariadne, after the Theseus and Ariadne bit on my podcast. So we won't give it away, but also you can listen to it on my podcast. Well, honestly, I mean, I think Ariadne is a really exciting and wonderful book. I'm so excited that we have all these new adaptations of Greek myth by women. There seemed to be a huge resurgence in it now, which is so exciting, both for the authors who get to tell these stories and find success in telling these stories, right? Like that's so exciting to me, that people are finding real success in retelling these stories, but also just that there's such a market for it, specifically ones written by women and telling the stories of women. So I'm thrilled that Ariadne is coming into existence and that you have more in the works.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Honestly, I mean, yeah, it's all more Greek myth about and by women. Just the more the better,
Yeah. And yeah, I am also so glad that so many people seem to want these stories, because they are just so brilliant.
They are. Yeah, they're the best. They're the best. Well, thank you so much for doing this today, for talking to me, and congratulations on the book. It's so exciting. And congratulations on the next book that will be coming, eventually, soon enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, thanks very much.
Oh, nerds, thank you so much for listening. I hope you loved this conversation as much as I loved having it. Like I said, I cannot wait for you all to read Ariadne. I absolutely loved it. I love hearing about women of mythology. There is such an incredible resurgence in it now, and I am so here for it. Thank you all so much for listening. As always, it is so appreciated. You are all the best. I am Liv, and I love this shit.